Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. This is episode 4 of the Best Enemy Money Can Buy by Anthony Sutton. Soviet Agatha American Apple II. In the mid-1983, the Soviets introduced their first personal computer, the Agatha, or a rather curious name for a Russian product. Produced at Zelenograd outside Moscow, the Agatha was reverse engineered from the Apple II. Specific specifications are similar to the Apple, and the components are either Soviet-produced from reverse-engineered U.S. components or imported and brought openly or clandestinely in Europe or Japan. Officials of the Academy of Pedagogical Sciences have admitted that the Apple II served as a prototype for the Soviet Agatha. In 1985, COCOM set up new rules for microcomputers and made it legal to export without license low-powered 8-bit computers. Such a machine sells in the West for $100 to $500. The response was a flood of computer manufacturers attempting to make elaborate sales pitches to the multi-million Soviet microcomputer market. If the history is any judge, the Soviets will buy a few thousand and then attempt to reverse engineer and produce it in the Soviet Union. Presumably, the microcomputers, although low-powered, could have military applications, and indeed, this was openly admitted by a few major computer manufacturers. New York Times, February 8th, 1985. We have no illusions. Some of these are headed for the military. Military end use. Confirmation of military end use comes from unimpeachable sources. Soviet engineers who have worked on copying or reverse engineering in the Soviet Union and later defected to the West. These engineers have testified before Congress and provided firsthand evidence of Soviet military use of our technology. Here is a statement from Joseph Arkov, who graduated from a Soviet engineering school in 1970 and who now resides in the United States. Arkov worked in Soviet research installations. If, for example, a new American computer has been obtained by the Soviets, they will make a military application of it rather than a civilian application. And in my work in the second research installation, I had the assignment of copying Western and Japanese high technology. Arkov makes the interesting point that the Soviets are now so far behind technologically that they can no longer just reverse engineer as previously. They must import even the technology to manufacture high technology. They do not have the human resources or the fine-tuned equipment required to produce the high technology machinery they try to copy. Once they know what makes a given piece of machinery work, they find that they do not have the technical know-how and equipment to produce the product themselves. That is why they want Western high technology machines that will enable them to produce the products. And the Western products they desire are those produced in the United States. That is why they want American high technology machines with which they can produce the components for high technology products. Under Senate questioning, Arkov confirmed that the major application of our high technology is for military end uses. Mr. Arkov, well, the task of copying Western technology, part of their assignment was for the military. Is that the question? Senator Rudman, yes, let me just follow that up. You spoke in your prepared statement about the use of sophisticated American computers in various Soviet military operations, and also about the use of semiconductor technology. There are those in this country who feel that we had not transferred that technology legally to the Soviet Union. We sold them certain semiconductor technology and certain sophisticated computer technology in the late 60s and early 70s. The Soviets would not have achieved the advances in missilery which they have made in terms of the enormous throw weight and precision of their guidance systems. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that the sale of these semiconductors and these computers had given them a tremendous step forward in their technology in the defense area from your background and your knowledge? Mr. Arkov, yes, I think so. I can't tell exactly. It's hard to estimate the degree of advantage they got, but they gained there using American computers and American semiconductors. Control data deception. The 1973 Control Data Corporation Technical Assistance Agreement with the Soviet Union enabled the Soviets to complete Phase 1 of their semiconductor manufacturing plant, see Chapter 4. Highly significant is a comparison of Control Data Corporation's public argument to the media and Congress with this 1973 agreement and its totally one-sided presentation of the national security argument. One can only conclude that some CDC statements are deliberate untruths. We make this statement by comparing Control Data public statements, particularly those of Chairman William Norris, with internal documents and agreements with the Soviet Union. These documents are confidential, but copies are in our possession. On December 19, 1973, William Norris wrote Congressman Richard T. Hanna concerning public criticism of the CDC proposal to export advanced cybercomputers to the USSR. We extract some statements from the letter reproduced in full as Appendix C and compare it to extracts from CDC internal documents reproduced on pages 61 to 67. For example, Norris, we have offered the socialist countries only standard commercial computers, and these offerings have been in full compliance with the export control and administrative directives of the Department of Commerce. Comment, reference to the 1973 Protocol of Intent between CDC and the USSR, marked confidential, had reproduced here tells a vastly different story. Norris, many persons, including some of the witnesses before your committee, mistake the offering for sale of old or even current state-of-the-art hardware for transfer of advanced technology. This is not unusual because in many cases it is difficult for those who are not technologically well informed to distinguish advanced computer technology. Comment. Norris is comparing apples and oranges. What is old or current in the United States is far beyond state-of-the-art in the Soviet Union, when Norris was offering 1 million operations per second cybercomputer to the Soviets. The run-of-the-mill Soviet technology was in order of several thousands of operations per second, and that was on copies of imported equipment. If multinational businessmen like William Norris were honestly mistaken in their information or somewhat shaky in their logic, then perhaps it could be forgiven. After all, to err is human. Unfortunately, evidence proves beyond doubt that at least some of these deaf businessmen have deceived both Congress and the American public in an unseemly haste to make a buck. We have documentary evidence in the case of the Control Data Corporation and its chairman, William Norris. In the following pages, we print a series of letters from Control Data Corporation to a concerned member of the public and contacts between CDC and the Soviet Union. Exhibit A. Letter from American Council for World Freedom to its supporters identifying William Norris and CDC as exporters of valuable military technology to the Soviets. Exhibit B. A reply from William Norris. Dear Yellow Card Sender, dated May 5th, 1978. Note in particular the paragraph, while we did sign an agreement for technical cooperation with the Soviet Union, we have not transferred any computer technology to them. Exhibit C. Full text of cooperation agreement signed by William Norris in Exhibit B. Exhibit D, letter protocol of intent not mentioned by William Norris in Exhibit B, but which includes precise details of technology to be transferred in distinct contrast to the Norris claim. We have not transferred any computer technology to them. Most importantly, it will be seen that Control Data Corporation transferred a vast range of information and technology to the Soviets, not only on computers, but on manufacturing. Publisher's note, at this point, the original manuscript contained actual photocopies of documents. Due to the quality of the copies, the documents were also reset in full and placed in Appendix D of the original manuscript. Due to difficulty of reproducing the documents in an efficient manner, we will refer anyone wishing to read the documents to Appendix D. The deceived worldview of Control Data Corporation. William Norris, chairman of Control Data, has a lively correspondence with Americans anxious to learn his rationale for supporting the Soviet Union. We quote below an extract from a letter written by William Norris to an inquirer. You also made a reference, wrote Norris, in your letter to Russia's first democratic government that was overthrown by the communists. You are incorrect on this point. There never has been any democracy in Russia. As a matter of fact, the Russian standard of living is higher than it was under the Tsars. Further, you don't find a great deal of unhappiness in the Soviet Union over living conditions in the communist countries for two reasons. One, they have never known what democracy is, and two, life is better than it used to be. Here are the errors in the above Norris paragraph. There never has been any democracy in Russia. Incorrect. The Kerensky government from March to November 1917 was freely established and overthrown by the Bolsheviks with the aid of Western businessmen such as William Morris. You don't find a great deal of unhappiness in the Soviet Union over living conditions. Incorrect. Mr. Norris should look out the window of his Moscow office at the uniform drab blocks of apartments. How many families live in one room? How often do several families live in one apartment? How about the hours spent in food lines and the limited choice of consumer goods? In guns before butter economy, just how many individual Russians has Mr. Norris freely spoken with? Not those of the nomenclatura, but average Russians in the street. We venture to guess none at all. Standard of living is higher than the Tsars. Take one item, wheat. In 1906, Russia was the world's largest wheat exporter and the world's largest wheat producer. The climate is the same today as in 1906, yet is used as a forlorn excuse for Soviet pitiful wheat production. In fact, 80% of Russian bread today is made from imported wheat. The homegrown stuff is only fit for cattle feed. Without Western wheat, Russia today would starve. Is that a truly higher standard of living? Anyway, Russians today don't compare their standards to those of Tsar's times, but to the Western world. William Norris only sees what he wants to see, hears what he wants to hear, and presumably speaks from the limited impression of the world. In conclusion, we can thank Mr. Norris and Control Data Corporation that the Soviet military has been able to break into the electronics-based warfare of the late 20th and early 21st century. CDC fulfilled Phase 1 of the Soviet program for acquisition of Western semiconductor technology and mass production facilities. Chapter 6, Soviets in the Air. Before we got the U.S. guidance systems, we could hardly find Washington with our missiles. Afterwards, we could find the White House. Without the U.S. help, the Soviet military system would collapse in 1.5 years. Avraham Shifrin, former Soviet Defense Ministry official. Single rockets were used in the Russian Tsarist army as early as 1717. Present Russian theoretical work in rockets beginning in 1903 stems from K.E. Tosalovsky, who investigated atmospheric resistance, rocket motion, and similar problems. This Tsarist work was continued in the Soviet Union during the 20s and 30s. In 1928, pioneer Sokolovsky suggested the value of the contribution had been in theoretical calculations. Nothing has been achieved in practical rocket engineering. Then in 1936, V.F. Glushky designed and built a prototype rocket engine, the ORM-65. This rocket used nitric acid and kerosene as propellants. The Soviets then developed the ZHRD R3395, an aircraft rocket using nitric acid and aniline as a propellant. DuPont provided technical assistance and equipment for the construction of large nitric acid plants. During World War II, Soviet rockets used Russian cordite, which was 56.5% nitrocellulose. The nitrocellulose was manufactured under a technical assistance agreement made in 1930 with Hercules Powder Company of the United States. Finally, under Lend-Lease, 3,000 rocket launchers and a large quantity of propellants were shipped from the United States to the USSR. German assistance for Soviet rockets. A major boost to Soviet emissions in rocketry came from Germany at the end of World War II. Facilities transferred to the USSR included the rocket testing stations of Bilizna and Peenemünde, captured intact and removed to the USSR, the extensive production facilities for the V1 and V2 at Nordhausen and Prague, the records of reliability tests on some 6,000 German V2 and 6,000 German technicians, not the top theoretical men, most of whom were not released from Russia until the late 1950s. The German rocket program was in an advanced state of development in 1945. About 32,050 V1 flying bomb weapons had been produced in the Volkswagen plant at Wallersleben and an underground central works at Nordhausen. In addition, 6,900 V2 rockets had been produced, 6,400 at the underground Metall work at Nordhausen, and 500 at Peenemünde. Rocket fuel facilities had been developed in the Soviet zone, liquid origin plants at Schmiedebach in Thuringia and at Nordhausen, and a hydrogen peroxide plant at Peenemünde. The Germans undertook 2.5 years of experimental work in statistical flight and reliability evaluation on the V2 before the end of the war. There were 264 developmental launchings at Peenemünde alone. Middle work at Nordhausen was visited in June 1946 by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey teams, who reported that the enormous underground plant could manufacture V1s and V2s, as well as Junkers 87 bombers. V2 rockets were manufactured in 27 underground tunnels. The plant was well equipped with machine tools and with a very well set up assembly line for the rocket power unit. Its output at the end of the war was about 400 V2s per month, and its potential output was projected at 900 to 1,000 per month. When the Soviets occupied part of the American zone in July 1945 under agreement with General, later President Eisenhower, the Nordhausen plant was removed completely to the USSR. The United States and Britain never did gain access to the German rocket testing sites in Poland. The Sanders mission reached the Belizna test station after considerable delays in Moscow, only to find that its equipment had been removed. In such a methodical way as to suggest strongly to the mission's leader that the evacuation was made with a view to the equipment being redirected elsewhere. The Sanders mission accumulated 1.5 tons of rocket parts. Unfortunately, when the mission reached home, it found that the rocket parts had been intercepted by the Soviets. Rocket specimens of carefully crated in Bilzina for shipment to London and the United States were later seen in Moscow. The crates arrived at the Air Ministry in London, but contained several tons of old and highly familiar airplane parts when they were opened. The Bilzina rocket specimens had vanished. Many German rocket technicians went or were taken to the Soviet Union. The most senior was Helmut Rottrup, who had been an aide to the director of electronics at Peenemünde. 200 other former Peenemünde technicians were reported to have been transferred. Among those were Waldemar Wolf, chief of ballistics for Krupp, engineer Peter Laertes, and Hans Hock, an Austrian specialist in computers. Most of these persons went in the October 22 to 23 round of 92 train loads, comprising 6,000 German specialists and 20,000 members of their families. Askania technicians, specialists in rocket tracking devices, and electronics people from Lorenz, Siemens, and Telefunken were among the deportees, as well as from the Walter, I can't say that, in Prague. Asher Lee sums up the transfer of German rocket technology. The whole range of Luftwaffe and German Army radio-guided missiles and equipment fell into Russian hands. There were the two Heinkel radar-guided bombs, the HS-293, and the larger FX-1400. The USSR has acquired samples of German anti-aircraft radio-guided missiles like the X-4, the HS-298, air-to-air projectile with a range of about a mile and a half, the Rheintochter, which was fitted with a radar proximity fuse, and the very promising Schmetterling, which even in 1945 had an operational ceiling of over 45,000 feet and a planned radius of action of about 20 miles. It could be ground or air-launched and was one of the most advanced of the German small-caliber radio-guided defensive rockets. Of the various projectiles, the Heinkel 293 bomb and the defensive Schmetterling and HS-298, the V3, are undergoing development at Omsk and Irkutsk, and later at factories near Riga, Leningrad, Kyiv, Khabarovsk, Voronezh, and elsewhere. Other plants produced improved radars based on the Wurzburg system. The airborne Liechtenstein and Naxos systems were reported in large-scale production in the 1950s. The Soviets froze rocket design in the 1950s on developments based on German ideas. The German technical specialists were sent home. By 1959, the Soviets had landed a rocket on the moon. Sputnik, Lunik, and Soyuz programs. From the German V-2 rockets, Associated German produced facilities and all the important German reliability tests stemmed the contemporary Soviet ICBM and space rockets. In the 1960s, there were four types of large liquid rockets in the Soviet Union. The Soviet version of the V-2, the R-10, a 77,000-pound thrust scale-up of the German V-2. The R-14, a scale-up of the V-2 with a 220,000-pound thrust. And a modification known as the R-14A based on the R-14. The R-14 was designed and developed by a joint German-Russian team. The Germans were sent home in the late 1950s. The Soviets did not until fairly recently use single boosters. They used dusters of rockets strapped onto a central core. The strap-ons were the scaled-up and modified German V-2. Thus, for example, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2 had a first range of two R-14A units, a second stage of two R-14A units, and a third stage of a single R-10. The German V-2 produced in the Soviet Union. Lunik, with a similar cluster of 6 rocket units, the Vostok and Polyot series of clusters of 6 units. The planetary rockets, Cosmos series, and the Soyuz family are 7-unit clusters. An excellent photograph of one of these clusters vehicles is to be found in Leonid Vladimirov's book, The Russian Space Bluff. In the mid-60s, any foolhardy person who insisted that the United States would be first on the moon because the Soviets were technologically backward was dismissed as a dim-witted Neanderthal. But at least 2 skilled observers with first-hand access to the Soviet program made a detailed case, one in 1958 and one in 1969. Lloyd Milan wrote Russia and the Big Red Lie in 1958, almost unrestricted 14,000-mile trip through Russia to visit 38 Soviet scientists. He took 6,000 photographs. It was Milan who first drew attention to the Soviet practice of illustrating space program press releases with photographs from the American trade and scientific press. The Remington Rand UNIVAC computer was used in the 50s to illustrate an article in Red Star on the Soviet computer program. The captions were translated into Russian. In 1969, TASS issued a photograph for use in American newspapers purporting to show a Russian space station at the time when one Soviet spaceship was in orbit and another en route. The TASS photograph was reproduced from Scientific America, February 1962, and was identical to an advertisement in Sperry Gyroscope Company of Great Neck, New York. Sperry commented, "Apparently, it is the same ad we ran." The author personally remembers an incident from the early 1960s which illustrates the extraordinary success of Soviet propaganda in molding the U.S. concept of Russian technology. After giving a short speech to a Los Angeles audience on technical transfers to the Soviets, a member of the audience asked a sensible question: who will be the first on the moon, the U.S. or the Soviets? The answer, as closely as could be recalled, was to the effect that the Soviets did not have the technology to be the first on the moon and by themselves could not make it in this century. The response from the audience was an instantaneous and loud laugh. How ridiculous was this general audience response? Everyone knows the Soviets are far ahead of the United States in space. In fact, the Soviets could not even have achieved their Soyuz program without U.S. help. The docking mechanism is a direct copy of the U.S. docking mechanism. Unfortunately, NASA and U.S. planners have a conflict of interest. If they publish what they know about the backwardness and dependency of the Soviet space program, it reduces the urgency in our own program. This urgency is vital to get congressional funds. Without transfers of technology, the U.S. is in effect racing with itself. Not a very appealing argument to place before Congress. Why did the Soviets embark on a space program? From an economic viewpoint, a Soviet space program makes no sense at all. Such a program only makes sense from a geopolitical viewpoint. In 1957, the year of Sputnik, the Soviet Union had fewer telephones than Japan, 3.3 million in the USSR versus 3.7 million in Japan. On a per 100 population basis, the Soviet Union could provide only 3.58 telephones compared to 49.8 in the United States. Even Spain provided 9.6 telephones per 100 of population, or 3 times more than the Soviet Union. In automobiles, the Soviet Union was even less affluent. In 1964, the Soviet Union had a stockpile of 919,000 automobiles, all produced in Western-built plants, only slightly more than Argentina, 800,000, far less than Japan, 1.6 million, and the United States, 71.9 million. Even today, the Soviet Union is so backward in automobile technology that it has to go to Italy and the United States for automobile and truck industry technology. Although we in the West might see this technical backwardness as a natural reason for not going into space, the Soviets saw it as a compelling reason to embark on a space program. A technical extravaganza was necessary to demonstrate Soviet technical superiority to the world and maintain the myth of a self-generated Soviet military might. The Soviet economic problem in the mid-1950s was acute. The Soviet economy had shown good rates of growth, but this was due to the impetus given by Lend-Lease equipment and by war reparations. There were no signs of technical viability. Numerous industries were decades out of date, with no indigenous progress on the horizon. The only solution was a massive program of acquiring complete parts and up-to-date technology in the West. Beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through to the 1980s, this program had to be disguised because of obvious military implications. One facet of the disguise was the space program. The usual stock of reasons for backwardness had a dry run. The Civil War, the Revolution, intervention, warmongering capitalists, even the damage done by the Nazis could only be spread so far. So 2 new elements made their appearance. 1, a space program to get the Western world looking upwards and outwards, literally away from the Soviet Union and its internal problems. 2, concurrent articles and press releases in the West on Soviet technical achievements, spotted particularly in Western trade journals and more naive newspapers such as the New York Times. Around the same time, in the 60s and 70s, the West, or rather the United States and Germany, resurrected Edwin Gay's 1918 proposal to mellow the Bolsheviks, and this proposal now became Bridges for Peace, to provide a rational explanation for the massive transfers of Western technology that were required to fulfill Soviet programs. The United States appears, in historical perspective, to have been almost desperate in its attempts to help the Soviets in space. Of course, if the Soviets did not succeed in space, there could be no competing American space program, and many politicians, bureaucrats, and politically oriented scientists were determined for their own good reasons that there had to be a major American space effort. There also had to be American assistance for the Soviet space program. In the 10 years between December 1959 and December 1969, the United States made 18 approaches to the USSR for space cooperations. In December 1959, NASA Administrator R. Keith Glennon offered assistance in tracking Soviet manned flights. On March 7, 1962, President Kennedy proposed an exchange of information from tracking and data acquisition stations, and on September 20th, 1963, President Kennedy proposed joint exploration of the moon, an offer later repeated by President Johnson. On December the 8th, 1964, the administration proposed an exchange of teams to visit deep space tracking and data acquisition facilities. On May 3rd, 1965, NASA suggested joint communication tests via the Soviet Malila 1. On August 25th, 1965, NASA asked the Soviet Academy of Sciences to send a representative to the Gemini 6 launch. On November the 16th, NASA inquired about joint Malila 1 communication tests. Four U.S. offers were made in 1966. In January, NASA inquired about Venus probes. On March 24th and May 23rd, Administrator James Webb suggested the Soviets propose subjects for discussion. And in September, Ambassador Arthur Goldberg again raised the question of tracking coverage by the United States for Soviet missiles. Soviet aircraft development. In 1913 in St. Petersburg, Igor Sikorsky, who later founded the Sikorsky Aircraft Company in America, designed the Russky Vityazy, weighing 5 tons with a load of 7 passengers. This 4-engine plane established a contemporary endurance record of 1 hour, 54 minutes aloft. By 1917, a fleet of 75 IM Ilya Muromets 4-engine bombers, based on the original 1913 model, were in service, several decades before the American 4-engine bomber fleets of World War II. So Tsarist Russia produced and successfully flew the world's first 4-engine bomber a quarter of a century before the United States developed one. This early bomber had a wingspan of over 100 feet, or only 21 inches less than that of the World War II Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Obviously, there was nothing wrong with the indigenous Russian aeronautical talent half a century ago. While Russians have a natural affinity and geographic impulse towards aeronautics, the Soviets have only kept up with the West by reverse engineering, prolific borrowing, and importation of technology and manufacturing equipment. Russian dependency on Western aeronautical design and production equipment and technique goes back to the early 1920s. At that time, soon after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian aircraft industry depended heavily on foreign aircraft and engine imports. There was considerable Soviet design activity, but this work was not converted into usable aircraft technology. Consequently, in the early 1930s, the Soviet stock of military planes was almost completely foreign. 260 fighters, comprising 160 de Havilland Type 9A from Great Britain, and 100 Heinkel HD-43 fighters from Germany, 80 Avra 504K training biplanes from Great Britain, and some Morane Salinger monoplanes from France. 52 R3 planes, Russian TSAGI design, 20 R6 reconnaissance planes, Russian TSAGI design, 242 I-4 Jupiter engine planes from Great Britain, 80 Ju-30 and ANT-6 Junkers design, 20 ANT-6 bomber seaplanes, Russian design, 18 Avro 504L seaplanes from Great Britain, 40 Savoia 62 scouting flying boats from Italy, 150 Heinkel HD-55 scouting flying boats from Germany, 46 MR-4 Savoia S-62 licensed flying boats from Italy, 12 TBI Russian TSAGI design, and 43 Ju-30 naval bombers from Germany. From about 1932 onward, and particularly after 1936, there was extensive acquisition of Western aeronautical advances, which were then integrated with the development of the 1920s. Fortuitously for the Soviet Union, this much-needed acquisition coincided with a period of increased competition among Western aircraft manufacturers. In many cases, military aircraft were designed in the West on a Soviet account, and the heavy, slow, underpowered Russian designs of the 1930s were replaced by efficient Western designs. By 1937, the Soviet government was convinced that the American method of building aircraft was the best for Russian conditions, as the American system of manufacture could more easily be adapted to mass production than any of the European systems. The United States thus became the main source of Soviet aircraft technology, particularly as a builder of new Soviet aircraft planes. Between 1932 and 1940, more than 20 American companies supplied either aircraft, accessories, or technical assistance for complete planes and aircraft manufacturing plants. Technical assistance agreements were made for the Vultee attack bombers, the Consolidated Catalina, the Martin Ocean flying boat and Martin bombers, Republic and Sikorsky amphibians, Seversky amphibious and heavy bombers, Douglas DC-2 and DC-3 transports, the Douglas flying boat, and other aircraft. Kilmarx has well summarized this acquisition. The objectives of the Soviet Union were more straightforward than its methods. By monitoring aeronautical progress and taking advantage of commercial practices and lax security standards in the West, the Russians sought to acquire advanced equipment designs and processes on a selective basis. Emphasis was placed on the legitimate procurement of aircraft engines, including superchargers, propellants, navigational equipment, and array armament, specifications and performance data, design, production, and test information and methods, major tools, jigs, and dies, semi-fabricates, and critical raw materials. Licenses were obtained to manufacture certain modern military aircraft and engines in the USSR. At the same time, a number of Soviet scientists and engineers were educated at the best technical institutes in the West. Soviet techniques also included assigning purchasing missions abroad, placing inspectors and trainees in foreign factories, and contracting for service of foreign engineers, technicians, and consultants in Soviet plants. In 1937, the Soviet Union proposed the world's first commercial plane available to fly the Atlantic Ocean nonstop with a payload of 7,500 pounds. Known as the Martin Ocean Transport Model 156, with four 1,000 horsepower Wright Cyclone engines. It was built by the Glenn L. Martin Company of Baltimore. Model 156 cost the Soviet Union $1 million. Although capable of being flown directly to the Soviet Union, it was flown only to New York. Then was dismantled and shipped to the USSR by boat. Also in 1937, the Martin Company agreed to design a Soviet bomber. Loy Henderson, the U.S. charge in Moscow, reported, since January 1st, 1937, the embassy granted visas to 14 Soviet engineers and specialists who were proceeding to Baltimore to the Glenn L. Martin factory. This information would appear to be significant in view of the statements that the Martin Company is to design and develop a new type of large plane for the Soviet Air Force instead of selling somewhat obsolete models, which may have been released for export by the American military authorities. In May 1937, the New York Times reported a $780,000 Soviet contract with Seversky Aircraft Corporation involving constructing of and manufacturing rights for Seversky amphibians, which then held the amphibian world record of 230.4 miles per hour. Under a technical assistance agreement, Seversky Aircraft provided assistance for manufacture of these plants in the Soviet Union at the rate of 10 per day. Alexander P.D. Seversky, president of the company, then informed the State Department that the Soviets had contracted to produce from the company a large number of bombing planes of a new type to be designed by him, after being informed that a license would be granted if the planes involved no military secrets. Seversky suggested that a War and Navy department might object to its exportation merely on the ground that the new bomber would be superior to any bombing plane then in existence. Seversky indicated that he intended to address his request for an export license to the State Department in hope that the department might expedite his action in this. The first domestic flying boats under the Soviet control were constructed at Leningrad and Taganrog. In 1932, plant number 23 in Leningrad produced 18 Avro 504L seaplanes and 40 Savoia S-62 scouting flying boats. The later under license from the Società Eldorado Alta Italia of Milan, an outstanding designer of high-performance flying boats. Also, in 1932, Taganrog plant number 31 produced 196 flying boats, 150 scouting HD-55Ss, and 46 MR-5Ss, both built under license from Heinkel. The Soviets also acquired a license from the Machi Company of Italy to produce MBR series of Russian flying boats. Then in 1937 came an agreement with Consolidated Aircraft Company of San Diego for technical assistance for Catalina flying boats under supervision of Etienne Dormoy. With the Catalina flying boat, we once again see the extraordinary ability of the Soviets to acquire anything they set their hearts on. The very first commercial consolidated PBY Catalina of the assembly line in San Diego was sold to the American Museum of Natural History, which was probably transferred to the Soviets. This is not the first time the American Museum of Natural History turns up in the Soviet files. In 1919, the shipload of Soviet propaganda was seized en route to the United States and addressed to the American Museum of Natural History. Also in 1937-38, the Vultee Aircraft Division of Aviation Manufacturing Corporation of Downey, California, built a fighter aircraft plant for the Soviets in Moscow. Equally as important, the Soviets acquired rights to build the famous Douglas DC-3, probably the most successful transport plane in the history of aviation. Donald Douglas produced his first DC-3 in March 1935, and within 1 year, the Soviets decided this was to be the basic transport plane for the USSR. A technical assistance agreement with the Douglas Aircraft Company was signed on July the 15th, 1936 for 3 years. Within 30 years of contract signature, Douglas delivered the blueprint materials required to fulfill the assistance contract. In October 1937, the Soviet aircraft industry placed a $1.15 million order with Douglas for additional parts, tools, assemblies, and materials. The order included one complete DC-3 in subassembly and another in first-stage production. In addition, aluminum extrusions were ordered for another 50 aircraft, together with 2 complete sets of raw materials and 25 sets of finishing materials ranging from ashtrays to zippers. Construction facilities ordered at that same time included one complete set of 6,485 templates, a set of 350 lead and zinc drop hammer dies, 3 sets of hydraulic mechanisms, all the necessary wood and plaster patterns, drill and assembly fixtures, a complete set of drop hammer stamps, hydraulic press parts, 2 crowning machines, and a set of 125 special tools. Later, another 6 complete transports were purchased. Abruptly ends there. Chapter 7. The deaf mutes and the Soviet missile threat. As for businessmen, I can persuade a capitalist on Friday to bankroll a revolution on Saturday. That will bring him a profit on Sunday, even though he will be executed on Monday. Saul Alinsky, Chicago professional activist. The United States and the Western world today face a truly awesome threat from Soviet missiles. This threat would not exist if President Richard Nixon and National Secretary Advisor Henry Kissinger heeded warnings in 1970 from his own Department of Defense. And outside experts of the Soviets were lagging in missile production technology and require specific technologies from the West to MIRV, their 4th-generation ICBMs. MIRV capability is the ability to deploy a number of warheads from the same missile, thus vastly increasing throw weight. Soviet 3rd-generation missiles did not have this capability. As stated by Department of Defense report, it was not until the 4th generation that the technology became available to the Soviets, allowing greater throw weight and greatly improved accuracy so that high-yield MIRVs could be carried by operational missiles. The phase become available is a subtle way for DoD to state what has been concealed from the public, that the U.S. made the technology available, as we shall see below. The 4th-generation ICBMs are the SS-17, the SS-18, and the SS-19, which today have the capacity to destroy most of our 1,000 U.S. Minuteman missiles now operational, with only a portion of their warheads. All right, American accelerometers for Soviet missiles. Let's go back to the start of our help for the Soviet missile program. Accelerometers are small but vital instruments used in missiles and aircraft to measure gravitational pull. In 1965-68, the Soviets developed an extracurricular interest in American accelerometers, and a Soviet United Nations diplomat was forced to hurriedly leave the United States before being picked up for espionage involving acquisitions of U.S. accelerometers. Testimony of Leonard I. Epstein, Vice President of Trans-American Machinery and Equipment Corporation of New Jersey, to the House of Un-American Activities Committee, detailed Soviet interests in this American technology. Mr. Epstein related to the committee how he met Vadim Yeskov, a Russian employee of UNICEF, United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, on July the 15th, 1965, and how Iyasakov later visited Epstein's plant in New Jersey with a list of 4 items for purchase, including an accelerometer made by American Bosch Arma Corporation or similar company. The accelerometer is an intricate device which measures the pull of gravity on any vehicle, such as a missile or space orbiting device. The device costs about $6,000. Mr. Epstein, under instructions from the FBI, met several times with Iaskov to find out what he wanted. In October 1965, Iaskov began to push for delivery on the accelerometer. Epstein surmised that the urgency had something to do with the fact that the Soviets had smashed 3 vehicles onto the surface of the moon. Although Epstein was able to stall for quite some time on various grounds, Iaskov later became quite anxious to obtain an accelerometer. When Epstein pleaded export problems, Iaskov suggested he would use the Soviet diplomatic pooch. 18 months later, in August 1967, another Russian intensively interested in accelerometers turned up in the United States. This time under the auspices of the State Department Academic Exchange Program. From August 1967 to June 1968, Anatoly K. Kochev of the Kalinin Polytechnic Institute of Leningrad was at a Catholic university in the United States, working on construction methods of equipment to measure small accelerations and displacement. This is the manufacture of accelerometers. Is there any connection between Iaskov's unsuccessful espionage attempts to purchase accelerometers and Kochev's academic work on accelerometer manufacture in the United States, courtesy of the State Department? There are indeed obsolete accelerometers and sophisticated accelerometers. The Soviets knew the difference. They know how to make the obsolete versions, but they do not have the technical ability to make more sophisticated instruments. The trick is in the manufacturing process. That is, in knowing how to build into the instrument the sensitivity necessary to measure small gravitational pulls quickly and accurately. It is the manufacturing technique that was important to the Soviets, much more important than a boatful of purchased accelerometers. Why did Kochev come to the United States in 1967? The State Department reports the title of his project as Construction Methods of Equipment to Measure Small Accelerations. 10 months would be sufficient time for a competent engineer to determine the most modern methods in this field, and given the rather careless manner in which advanced accelerometers have found their way into used electronics equipment stores, it is unlikely that Kochev had major problems in adding to his knowledge of the state of the art. Why did the State Department make an agreement in 1966 to allow a Soviet engineer into the United States to study the manufacture of accelerometers only a few months after another Soviet national had been foiled by the FBI to purchase an accelerometer? We have no answer for that. All right, everybody, that's all for tonight. So we have Corbin and Record Deepness in the chat. Thank you here for showing up. Oh, also, hello. Let's see, chat. Record Deepness. On the topic of aircraft, one can't forget the B-29. The project to develop that bomber was more expensive than the Manhattan Project. The Soviets acquired and copied it as the Tu-4 Bull. Correct. Record Deepness. MIRV capability also makes defending with ABMs much more complicated. Yes, it does. All right, everyone. Make sure to tune in next week for part 5 of The Best Any Money Can Buy. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.